If you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. If you do read it, you're misinformed. What is the long-term effect of too much information?
Information, I just need some information. I've been dying. Is it lack of education? I've been reading without any transformation. I'm addicted. Is it overstimulation? Hey.
Welcome to the Sixth Sense Report.
Hear ye, come one, come all. You are listening to the Sixth Sense Report with Joel Nikoloff and Darnell Samuels.
Unfortunately, I have returned to Canada.
The Rock has come back!
That gives me deja vu.
Finally!
My childhood.
Yeah, well, welcome back, man. Yeah, sorry you had to come back.
Yeah, well, I mean, hey, they're looking to be different. I won't be the only one not wearing a mask. Let's put it that way.
Okay. Oh, yeah, that's right. It's March 1st, and they lifted the.
Well, I think the vaccine passports.
Well, for restaurants, gyms, theaters.
Essentially, it's no longer mandatory now. Companies can elect to segregate voluntarily.
Right. Yeah, no, that's pretty interesting, and I agree. I agree with Doug Ford. Doug Ford's my guy, by the way.
I really hope you're joking. It's so funny. Like when you catch him talking sort of off the cuff, you're like, okay, I kind of agree with this guy.
No.
But he does things with his policies. Like I'm assuming you're referring to the clip where he's like, you know, we got to learn to live with this. Clearly, the prime minister's got 3 shots and he got COVID. I know hundreds of people who got all 3 and got COVID.
And then he was talking about the free market correcting itself. I was just like, yo,
I said, who is this guy?
Who is this guy? What have you done with the real Doug Ford, man? and it's funny because I said, you know what? I low key like this guy, in the sense that, he's political. He's a true politician. Like he sees the current moving. He sees the current moving, and he's like, okay. Let me put on this hat and play this role. I was like, oh wow, like he's very convincing. I was like, okay, cool. I'm like, all right, cool. Like I respect rappers for rapping. Right? I respect actors for acting. I respect politicians for being politicians. Be a politician. Do your thing, man, but do it right.
Yeah, but see, like, I think Michael Malice has this quote. I'm gonna butcher it because I think he refers to media, but he goes essentially something to the effect of, when we refer to politicians the same we refer to tobacco executives, we're in a good place.
Yeah. No, that's good. Okay, so for the listeners, we're going to be bringing some clarity to some key terms that we want to that we'll be using in the future episodes coming up, and so we want to make sure that we nuance them, because we won't necessarily have time to nuance them in some upcoming episodes. Ones on especially the war in the Ukraine. And an upcoming episode with Germinal on classical liberalism in Africa. And so we're like, Joel was it crossed his mind to talk about fascism, and it crossed my mind to talk about liberalism.
Yeah, and I mean, actually, the episode that aired, I guess last week when this comes out,
mm-hmm.
There was a moment on that podcast where I mentioned, I thought the Canadian healthcare system was socialist, and the American healthcare system is very much fascist, but they're both authoritarian in regards to the government, largely influencing or controlling how things work in those industries. And I had to. There was a bit of back and forth with Steve regarding what I meant by that, and I think the reason is, we've got Antifa promoting this anti-fascist thing, but I would say largely they're anti a straw man of fascism, because there's sort of a vagueness to the use of the word fascism, sort of how racist and Nazi gets thrown around sort of unintentional or non-specifically as a more derogatory term than actually calling out the things that we would normally associate with those words. And so I think it's I was thinking, from that conversation as well as other conversations that really, what is fascism, right? Does Antifa even qualify as anti-fascist? Hopefully when we're done with this conversation, the listener can sort of answer that question for themselves, along with, as you said, what are some of the other terms that maybe will be relevant for future conversations, especially in light of Tyrant Trudeau and his recent actions.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's start with fascism. How are you defining it, Joel?
Well, actually, I have a really good article by Sheldon Richman that I think the headline, if you want to call it that, or the intro sentence really does a good job of summarizing it, and then I'll read a second sentence later. That I think in my opinion, does a really good job of describing what fascism is. So the first sentence of this article, so I'm going to put a link to it from econlib.org. It's also in fee.org, but I like the econlib one. So the first sentence is, as an economic system, fascism is socialism with a capitalist veneer. And he goes on to define it in the next paragraph. So where socialism sought totalitarian control of a society's economic process through direct state operation of the means of production, fascism sought that control indirectly through domination of nominally private owners. So again, this is where I thought that the application to healthcare in Canada versus contrasting with US, both of them are authoritarian or totalitarian under the government's influence on how healthcare is run in both countries. But in Canada, it's by owning the means of providing healthcare. And in the US, it's through, I would argue, the overburden of regulation, as well as, the way that they do their health insurance now. Essentially, it's a government mandated insurance. So yeah, this is where I would say nominally private insurance companies, where the government is the one deciding, how that insurance company is supposed to, what type of policies are available, what is required in policies, as opposed to a company saying, hey, what do our customers want? What kind of policies can we, provide at a value that also makes us some money? So yeah, that I think, to me, that is a really good definition of fascism. And what that, again, just to overall provide a quick summary, is it's the government's authoritarian or totalitarianism in a particular area through coordination with private businesses. So similar word or similar concept is the idea of cronyism or crony capitalism, where, capitalism and government or capitalist organizations, private entities and government are so embedded that essentially the government is carrying out its control or influence through companies rather than by owning the companies, i.e. socialism.
Can I cross-examine you real quick?
Sure.
Can we make a distinction between politics and economics? Because I think I would disagree to say with that person, and I could be wrong in regards to calling fascism an economic principle versus I kind of see it more as a political one. Like, do you think we should make the distinction between politics and economics? Because, like, we've talked about it before, politicians are not economists.
Yeah, so maybe this clarification, agree or you don't agree. I would have said that, in light with what you're saying, the political motivations and the economic implications are two different things.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Right. So what are the economic implications of a fascist society?
Yes.
Or fascist environment versus the political environment that leads to fascism, or what might be the political motivations behind a fascist scenario. right? So let's use the trucker convoy. Trudeau is trying to be fascist when he is using the the tow truck companies to execute his means. And then instead of taking captive the company and saying, oh, now I own your stuff, i.e. socialism, he tries to pass a law that forces the private business to cooperate with him or face fines. Right? So the motivation being political, but what are the economic consequences? So maybe I'll what exactly were you trying to differentiate or highlight with the economic part of it?
No, it was, I think it plays a role as we start to get into liberalism. It's just one of those things I wanted to make clear, because it can kind of get confusing to say that to conflate the two terms, politics and economics, because we can make a distinction about what an economy is, and politics affects the economy, but what politicians are doing is not economics, right?
Yeah.
And so, and that's all I wanted to clarify. Actually, I did some research as well on the idea of fascism, and I was kind of looking at it from the historical perspective with Giovanni Gentile, who was an Italian philosopher, educator, and fascist politician. And so the definition, and that's where I was looking to pull the definition from. And he was saying that he says that the state should embody the people. So all aspects of society should be a part of the state. So trade federations, unions, and other such organizations should be made into state corporations. These organizations do not need to compete with the state, but rather act as part of it towards a common goal. And so, and so the pushback would be not everyone will want to submit to the state. So then the result is they must be forced. And then also I looked at Benito Mussolini, and he was a politician in Italy from the 1920s to the 1940s. And Mussolini's revisions to what Gentile did, he said about the fascist doctrine, he embraced the claim that violence was more important than belief, and that violence was the best kind of propaganda. He claimed that violence was a superior method of the people to demonstrate their political will than elections and referendums. Right. So the word fascism actually, in Italian, it's a word for, which means bundle.
Yeah. And I was looking at the fascism definition through Britannica.com. So, Encyclopedia Britannica. And one of their one of the statements was sort of that, fascist movements require the unity of the people.
Okay.
And that's where it sort of aligns with that bundle concept.
Yeah. But of course, the bundle, not everybody in the bundle is gonna want to be a part of the bundle. But I wanted to throw something at the listeners and you as well, Joel, and something to think about. So for the listeners, you can push pause and go get your pen and pencil, and tell me what you guys think. What's going to happen next? So there's this a philosopher. His name's Jason Stanley. Jason Stanley is an American philosopher who is the Jacob Orlowski Professor of Philosophy at Yale University, and he's author of the book How Fascism Works: The Politics of Us and Them. And so I was watching a video of him. I'll put it in the show notes, and he was basically giving the 10 tactics of fascism. So we study this thing in theory, and you're like, okay, fascism, okay, I got to remember for the test next week. But what does it actually look like? Like how do we know when fascism is at work? And so he gives 10 quick, and these are just quick 10. I'm not going to go deep. It's just 10 key points on all these things come together to bring together fascism. So these things, it isn't fascism on its own, right? It's not fascism on its own, one of these points. It's fascism. All of these points come together to make fascism. All right. So listen up, listeners, and let's take some notes. All right. So point number 1, the mythic past. In the past, we were great, but it has been taken from us. Right. So the mythic past. In the past, we were great, but it was taken from us. Point 2, propaganda. And what he says about it is that it's a friend-enemy distinction. So the other are against the nation. Point 3, anti-intellectualism. So it's against diversity of thought. Point 4, unreality. So politically, the citizens don't get to hear both sides of the argument. And so the people are used to lies. Point 5, hierarchy. One group is better than another. Point 6, victimhood. So victims of equality. So whites are victims of blacks. Men are victims of women. Men are victims of women, and so forth. Point 7, law and order. The leader can't violate law. The leader can't violate law and order because the leader structures it. Right, so the leader is above the law. Point 8, sexual anxiety. So you need a strong leader to go against the sexual revolution and so forth. And then point 9, he calls it Sodom and Gomorrah. And he calls it, in what he's talking about is the urban-rural divide, that, the inner city is bad, and those on the outskirts are the good people. Like all the bad stuff happens in the core of a city. And then the last one is work shall make you free. So value those who work and work hard, and those who don't. And that kind of points to as well, like degrading those who aren't mentally well, right? Those who aren't able to work. So it's not necessarily those who are lazy, but also those who are incapable of work. So what'd you think? What'd you think of those?
Yeah, I think it's sort of to me, it was almost be like common characteristics if you were to look at historical scenarios.
Mm-hmm. And he points back to, like, these are some of the points from Nazi Germany and Italy under Mussolini.
Yeah, and I mean, I would say it's not going to be a definitive list because it's going to depend on the context, right? So if you have a leader, I got a few articles that I can put in just from, I thought were helpful, right? Like I've sort of been using the term authoritarian and totalitarian back and forth. But they're like, I got the final line here says, authoritarianism is in fact totalitarianism, but there are some distinct features that help differentiate them. And so the reason I bring that quote up is like, the differentiation has to do with the ruler and how that person's intending to rule, right? So it says totalitarian leaders often hide their intentions behind a certain ideology, which is supposed to be beneficial for the community, while authoritarians focus more on having power, right? And my point is that if you're under an authoritarian sort of fascist approach versus a totalitarian fascist approach, versus under a socialist, more socialist approach, i.e. the state owns everything, versus working with corporations, the fruit of that environment is going to be different. And so therefore this list may be more or less true in some context, depending on really what I'm saying, the nature of the leader, the tendencies towards, like we've always said this before, when it comes to capitalism and sort of socialism, there's always a spectrum. And so when it comes to fascism, totalitarianism, liberty versus authoritarianism, there's always a spectrum. And so, that's where I think the list is helpful, but it's also important to recognize that every scenario, every context that this plays out in, there's so much nuance, whether it be the people, the culture, the state, the level of wealth the country or region had prior to this, that are all going to play a factor into, how true or how much that list appears or is sort of vaguely there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I wanted to also add that I think like part of making some nuances that might be helpful for the listener, as like when you think about fascism. So the difference, because I was getting the two confused, fascism and communism, and so the difference is like in regards to like a political spectrum. Communism is more about equality and authoritarianism,
Mhm.
and then fascism is more about inequality and authoritarianism.
Mm.
Right. And with that said, liberalism, if we can transition into that, is more so about freedom and inequality. Now, it's not intentionally seeking inequality, but usually the result is inequality.
But the funny part is, it embedded into liberalism is the quality of opportunity, right? As opposed to a quality of outcome.
Okay, I'm gonna get to that. Keep talking.
Just for the listener, going back to Encyclopedia Britannica, I thought they had a good definition of what is liberalism. Liberalism is a political and economic doctrine that emphasizes individual autonomy, equality of opportunity, and the protection of individual rights, primarily to life, liberty, and property, originally against the state and later against both the state and private economic actors, including businesses.
Okay, good. I like that definition, and I think it pointed back to what I was saying in the start, that it's political, but it's also an economic concept, and I think it's important to make a distinction between the two, like I said prior. So, for example, classical liberalism, in regards to the economic perspective, and I want to just define that before we get into the conversation with Germinal. And so the idea of classical liberalism, again, it's about free markets, individual liberty, and limited government. So the government's role is to protect life, liberty, and property. So people who are listening, they're probably like, okay, do I agree with that or not? So some of the points as it relates to the government's role is: liberty is the primary political value. Individual is more important than the collective. Skepticism about power: individual is best judge of their own interests. Principles in the rule of law. Civil society, so voluntary organizations, family, church, charities. 6, spontaneous order. We don't need someone to control the market. No government planning. Point 7, free markets. Government should not tell the people to do. 8, tolerance, not forcing my opinion on things I disapprove of. 9, peace, not interfering in other countries' favor on other countries. So it favors non-interventionist foreign policy. Free movement of capital, labor, and then the last point, point 10, limited government, protect life, liberty, and property.
Yeah, I think it's a good, going through that list, you sort of see both the political and economic sort of overlap. And I mean, that makes sense, right? Like, politics and economics have a huge overlap. That's why the running joke is, so do you know what the first rule of economics is?
What?
Scarcity. Right? So essentially it's because we have scarcity of resources, we have to economize the use of the resources. Do you know what the first rule of politics is?
What?
Ignore economics. Because we don't deal with scarcity, we ignore the concept of scarcity. Politicians just make promises. They don't talk about, oh, here's how it's going to net effect be better. No, how can I help you, this group of people who will then vote for me?
Right. Yeah. And I think, like, yes, right. Of course. Yes. So in regards to and that's why I say make the distinction between the politics and the economics. Now, as philosophies, right? I think there's pros and cons to both fascism and liberalism. So one of I would say the pros of fascism is nationalism, right? In the sense that the unity of the country. I think that's a good thing, and to fight and defend your country. I think that's a good thing.
Well, and
I think that can get.
It's many fascist states require nationalism in order to have the buy-in from the people.
Right. Yes.
But I think just to as a point of clarification, you can have nationalism without being fascist.
Yes. Right. And same thing. And I think with liberalism, I think, well, I've been reading the book, Why Liberalism Failed, by Patrick J. Dennin. He's a professor of political science and holds a David A. Ponce Memorial College Chair of Constitutional Studies at the University of Notre Dame. Right? And so, by the way, it wasn't an easy book to read, man. But anyways, it wasn't easy because the way he writes. But anyways, but he was saying like the problem that liberalism is its own worst enemy, right? So basically, he's saying liberalism failed because it in a sense it ate itself alive. So for example, I'm bringing it back to the point that you made about liberalism is about equality, and so he's saying, pardon,
of opportunity.
Yes, and he says
or in other words, it's also equality under the law. I think is the related principle.
Yeah, so the equality of opportunity is a problem, and so he says, okay, look, it isn't one school of thought with liberalism; it's two schools of thought. Right, so you have a progressive perspective, and then you have a conservative perspective, and so the progressive perspective, or sorry, I'll start with the conservative. So with the conservative perspective, right, it's saying, okay, look, equality of opportunity, do your thing, but that creates disparity, right? It creates inequality because some people are stewarding their resources better than others, and there's division. Mm-hmm. And so the progressive liberals come in and say, okay, well, we have to bring this back to equality of opportunity. So what it tries to do is reorient the market through the government to bring back equality in society, right? So essentially, progressives are fighting for equality of opportunity to correct the inequality that was created by the conservative liberals.
Yeah, I would just say, if I was to reword it, they're fighting the unequal outcome that was created by equal opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So,
yes. Yeah. So the idea is to say, okay, look, the culture that the conservative liberals have created, right, has created inequality. Which I agree with, right? And it wasn't on purpose. It's just some people do.
It's a feature, not a bug.
Right. And so it's what happens. And so for the progressives, they see it as, okay, fine, we're going to try to fix this. And so what they're trying to do is say, okay, look, we're going to try to undo the culture, right? We're going to try to undo the culture that creates the disparity, the individualism. So like they're against the family, and this thing kind of flows into aspects of the church and the family and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I think that gets in. I think if what you're talking about gets into strategy, as opposed to the core ideology, right? So the strategy to achieve their goal gets into what you discussed, because, I mean, without going too much down the rabbit hole, but the idea of inalienable rights is derived from the fact that we are all made imago Dei.
In the image of God, yeah.
Right. And so because everyone else is an image bearer of God, they have a level of rights that I need to respect.
Hi, I'm Darnell Samuels. You may remember me from such podcasts as Thanks Coach and the Sixth Sense Report. When Joel and I are not studying for the next episode, we're paying bills for hosting and production. If you want to help us out, you can make a donation of any amount by clicking the Buy Me a Coffee link in the show notes. If you broke, don't worry about it. You can subscribe and leave us a review on your podcast catcher. If you did this already, then you can share the show with a friend. Joel, Jeezy, and I appreciate your support. Now back to our regularly scheduled program.
Okay, let me read a section from the book for you to give better context. So, liberalism's second wave, which is progressivism, argued that the rampant inequality that first wave liberalism so successfully advanced was, in fact, an obstacle to realization of true selfhood. Later, liberals agreed that the first wave of liberalism had successfully undermined the old aristocratic political and economic forms, but concluded that its very success had generated new pathologies that needed a reinvented liberalism. Liberalism today is widely identified as the opposite of early modern liberalism's encouragement of economic liberty and hence stratification, instead stressing the imperative for greater economic equality. Right? So the idea is this, rather it sought to extend, right? So this is progressive liberalism. Rather, it sought to extend the weakening of social forms and cultural traditions already advanced by classical liberalism, with an end to increasing political consolidation. Under classical liberalism, this end could best be achieved by limiting government's authority over individuals. For progressive liberalism, it was best achieved by empowering the state to equalize the fruits of an increasingly prosperous society while intervening more actively in the realms of church, family, and even human sexuality.
Yeah, and I think I don't know if we want to necessarily go down this road too far, but really what we're talking about is, Marxist critiques of the or sort of the progression of Marxist critiques, right? That have now taken over the progressive liberals. And the reason I say that is because, and I've probably said this on the show before, in early 1930s, 40s, when this, Marxism versus free market debates were going on, the Marxists were pushing the idea that you would actually achieve economic utopia in the long run under their socialist governmental control of everything. And it was really the Ludwig von Mises' economic calculation problem that demonstrated, well, actually, no, it is the free market that needs price changes to communicate underlying information that no central planner, even with the best of computers programming, they aren't able to actually, because prices don't exist when the government's planning everything. Mm-hmm. And so the reason that the relevance here is that when that was broken down, the only real major critique of the Marxists that preserved was the inequality of the system. And really, that is the basis of all Marxist critiques today, for the most part. I would say Frances Woodison is probably the rare exception where she's like the hardcore technical Marxist. She may still argue in line with the economic utopia position, but that's a very rare position. The common position is the arguing on basis of inequality. And the reason I said it's a feature, not a bug, is because it goes back to the concept of meritocracy. So in the economic world, when you have higher merits, your business is more successful. And the business entrepreneur whose merits are very low goes bankrupt. And what that means is that the resources are used by those who produce the most. And the question becomes, is there a level of inequality necessary to progress? And I would argue that the progressives today don't entertain that question. They just default to inequality is bad. There's no conversation to be had that inequality might be necessary to actually have less people in poverty, or the way that I always like to word it, to increase the standard of living of the lowest levels of society. So if 10 years from now, one system has a higher standard of living for the lowest level of society, regardless of inequality, that's the system I want, right? I want to have the least amount of poor people, or the poor have more things than under the other system. So the problem with the inequality argument is I have less differences between the poor and the rich. But if the poor are worse off, why does the smaller variance matter? So I know it's a bit of the rabbit trail.
No. I was definitely tracking with you. I see what you're saying. So then, okay, so what would you want to leave the listeners with? What's your 2 cents?
I think it's important to familiarize yourself with these concepts, with fascism, with classical liberalism. Today our even our conservatives and liberals, like, those words don't mean anything other than team blue and team red. Like, our politics have become like sport. They've become, cultish type followings. I stick to the ideologies. I don't actually I ostracize the people on the other team. Right? Like, it's the reason why I say it's important to understand this is because we want Republicans and Democrats, we want in Canada, the conservatives and the liberals, to actually have principles and argue based on concepts and principles, and actually, in our House of Commons, actually answer questions based on concepts and principles, not platitudes and platforms. And so understanding, well, what is fascism? Because when Antifa's running around telling you they're what are they
anti-fascist?
They're not actually anti-fascist. They're a group of people who want to use violence against people who they think are politically wrong. Right? Like, are conservatives fascist? Well, no, conservatives want to stop, if I use the cake baking thing, because in that context, the conservatives want the government to stop telling businesses what to do, which is anti-fascist, right? Like, but that somehow Antifa would say, no, they're being fascist because the government doesn't force the business to serve everybody. Like, it's double speak. It's conflating of a term in order to confuse people, in order to align with them. Again, based on ideology, not concepts or principles. And so, that's where I'll put a couple links about difference between totalitarianism, authoritarianism. As I said, I got the article from Fascism by Sheldon Richman. I got a few, it's Encyclopedia Britannica links. You'll notice the fascism one doesn't have a really good it has top questions. For the totalitarianism and liberalism, it does it. First question is, what is liberalism? Well, for fascism, it doesn't have that question. And one of the reasons being, it sort of says that although fascism is a notoriously difficult ideology to define. And then it goes on to talk about different fascist movements, but sort of boxing in the fascist. And that's why I put I'll put the Sheldon Richman article, because for me, I think that encapsulates it perfectly. It's how do you contrast it with socialism? How is it similar? How is it different? If I was to look at Canada, we talk about healthcare being socialist. Well, our farming is very fascist because we have what's called agricultural boards, where they set prices and quotas. And so the government's telling businesses how to operate their business, how much they're allowed to produce, at what price they're allowed to sell it. Right? This is fascism, when the government's a high level of control and influence. And they get the good, again, this article from Sheldon Richman does a good job of demonstrating, things like antitrust or minimum wage are not examples of fascism if you compare it to like multi-year plans from the Ministry of Economics that sort of like schedule out how everyone else is supposed to do their how their business is supposed to be run. Right. So, again, I think if you understand, so what's my 2 cents or what I want to leave the listener with. It's important to understand these words because, as we've said, these things play out in society on a spectrum. There's never an absolute fascist. There's never absolute totalitarianism, probably until the point of collapse when you end up with Mao or Pol Pot or Stalin killing mass amounts of people in order to fulfill or continue their reign. And so, if we were to pull back from those absolute worst case scenarios, most of these things play out in the spectrum. And so if you don't know what the word means, how are you going to know where you are on the spectrum? And I would argue you end up sort of being blown to and fro by those with good sounding arguments, as opposed to being able to critically think, hey, wait a second, they just said this, but it doesn't line up with the actual definitions of the terms they're using. Mm-hmm. What about you? What's your 2 cents, or what do you want to leave the listener with?
Okay, so what I want to leave the listener with for my 2 cents is, of course, I'll address the fascism, and then after I'll address the liberalism. So historically, fascism thrives on national disenfranchisement. So I think the pandemic has brought Canadians to a turning point in our history as it relates to how we see ourselves in relation to the government. I think the Prime Minister has driven a wedge between Canadians in his favor, not to mention his gradual centralizing of power. Canadians need to humble themselves and ask, are we above those 10 tactics of fascism? Because if it's anything I've learned in the last 2 years, is that anything is possible. And now, as it relates to liberty for Christians, we must remember liberalism flows out of the biblical teaching of Christian liberty, as we see in Romans chapter 6, verse 17 to 19, that true freedom is the ability to do what's right, and slavery is to be trapped in sinful behavior. So we must be aware of the limits of political liberalism, in that it idolizes the individual. Conservatives and progressives both seek government's protection for man to be liberated from God. How, you ask? Conservative liberals idolize nature, innovation, prosperity. And progressive liberals idolize sinful human nature as it relates to sexuality. And I'll leave you with John 8, verse 36. So if the Son sets you free, you are free indeed. And that's the bottom line. Because do-gooder Darnell says so.
I love that you've referenced 2 iconic wrestlers from the 90s in the same episode.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
We started with The Rock. We finished with Stone Cold. No big deal.
Right.
So,
2 legends, two true legends.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So please, guys, let us know what you think of this episode. Was anything clear? Anything that needed to be redefined? Was it helpful? Where to contact us.
Are there other concepts like fascism, liberalism, and that
other
want
words
us to hash out and maybe define?
Mm-hmm. Because like you said before, Joel, we want to use the right words and use the right terms and be able to use the right vocabulary to articulate the things we see in the world, versus like using the wrong words and having a misconception of what we're seeing in the real world.
6 cents makes change.
But you heard me? Does that make sense?
Madden and Mitchell Media.